Hello. Good evening. My name's Davidson, for those who don't know me. I'm the Cultural Advisor for Matai. I thought it'd be fitting that we start our evening off with a karakia. So, kia inoi tātou, let us pray. Tēnei au, te hōkai nei o taku tapu ai. Ko te hōkai nuku, ko te hōkai rangi, ko te hōkai ato tātou tīpuna tāne nui ārangi. I pikiti ai ki ngā rangi tūhaha, ki te tihi o manono. I riro iho ai, ko ngā kete o te mātauranga, ko te kete tuauri, ko te kete tuatea, ko te kete aronui. Ka tiritiri a, ka paupau a ki papatu anuku, ka puta te ira whai ao ki te ao mārama. Uhi, wero, haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tāe ki e. A tēnā tātou. Ko te mihi tuatai ki tō tātou nei kaihanga, nāna nei ngā mea katoa. Kia rātou mākua whetūrangitia. Rātou te hunga mate, ko nunumi atu ki tō pai, ki te ao kore, haere. Tātou, te hunga ora, e hui hui mai nei, e aku nui, e aku rahi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good evening. I thought I'd start off my kōrero this morning with an incantation. Basically, to summarise, it was about Tāne. Everyone heard of Tāne, the god of the forest. Tāne rose up to the uppermost heavens. There he retrieved 3 baskets of knowledge. The basket of light, which represents the present knowledge amongst us. The basket of darkness, which represents the unknown knowledge, the unknown potential out in our world. And the basket of pursuit. And for us in research, the basket of pursuit and that world of darkness is where we're at. And so I leave that with you. He mihi tēnei ki te hapori no Neurological Foundation, Sarah. Kōrua ko Nick. Tēnei te mihi atu kia kōrua ko haramai no Ōtautahi. No tāmaki makaurau hoki. So I welcome our friends from the Neurological Foundation, Sarah from Auckland, and Nick, who's joined us from Christchurch. Welcome. On behalf of Matai as well, Matai Medical Research, welcome. Without further delay, I'll pass it back over to Sarah, but have an amazing evening. Bring all that knowledge that's in the darkness that you're about to hear tonight into your basket of light. Kia ora.
Thanks so much, Dave, for a fantastic welcome tonight. We're so excited to be in Tairāwhiti, and I think it's my first time here ever. I'm the Head of Research at the Neurological Foundation, and I also want to thank Matai for hosting us today. I got to meet the team and have a tour of their facility at the hospital, and it's really incredible to see and exciting for us to be partnering with the research that's going on into Understanding Concussion. So we fund Nick Draper's project, and he partners with Matai, and we're really excited to hear tonight. We're going to hear from Dr. Josh McGowan from Matai and Associate Professor Sam Holdsworth and Professor Nick Draper from the University of Canterbury. So welcome everyone, and thank you very much to our speakers and also to Nick for travelling here tonight.
All right. Sound okay? Yeah? Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for the Neurological Foundation for putting this on. My name's Josh. I'm a research fellow here. My interest in this topic is very personal. Knowing what I know now, I think I've probably had about 18 concussions in my life, and I dealt with some really bad symptoms after my last 2, which led to me becoming really passionate about understanding this injury more and what we can do to make games safer and help people rehabilitate more effectively. So we're here tonight to talk about the brain. I'm a bit biased because it's my job, but I think the brain's pretty cool. It's made up of 100 billion cells called neurons, And it's beautiful how through just some chemistry and some electricity, those webs of those neurons turn into our ability to converse with one another, to remember a meal we had with a loved one in Italy 20 years ago, to send people to the moon, and so on. But sometimes we injure our brain, and that's really what we're here to talk about tonight. So traumatic brain injury occurs to about 27 million people around the world each year. And 95% of those injuries are what we would consider mild traumatic brain injury or mild TBI. And what that means is generally in those circumstances, those injuries aren't life-threatening, and they're not necessarily going to be associated with long-term permanent impairment like being in a coma, but that doesn't mean that they're not serious injuries. Approximately 20% of all TBIs occur during participation in sport or physical activity. And of those, about 98% of them are what we would call a mild TBI, or what day-to-day we're going to refer to as concussion. In New Zealand, approximately 50% of all sport-related concussions occur in people who are 18 years of age and under. And out of all people who suffer concussion, about 50% aren't fully recovered 6 to 12 months after their injury. And that's important to highlight because we used to think that about 90% of people would bounce back within about 2 weeks. Without any intervention or help, they would just get better on their own. And what these more up-to-date stats say is that's not the case, and that's what the rationale is for why we're doing this research to understand this complicated injury. In the spectrum of New Zealand, the most common sport-related causes are actually cycling, followed by rugby, football, and swimming. You might say swimming. How do you hurt your head swimming? It's usually when people dive into something that they don't know, and then they whack their head off a rock, a log, or the bottom of a pool. There is a reason why there's a little piece of Jell-O vibrating on the bottom of this slide, is because that's a good example of kind of what the consistency of your brain is. It's very Jell-O-like. And so it's got that Jell-O consistency, it's floating in fluid, and it's protected by your skull, and that allows us to move around, drive our car on a bumpy road full of potholes and not injure our brain. But sometimes those protective mechanisms aren't enough, and it's when we take a big enough hit. So what concussion actually means is it's a Latin term for to shake violently. Okay, and this video depicts that really well, where we see that the brain kind of bounces off of the inside of the skull. In a sports context, and in most contexts, there's usually 3 main mechanisms for how this happened: a direct impact, an indirect impact, or projectile. Direct and projectile, pretty straightforward to understand, but indirect is one that is usually good to highlight, where an example of this is maybe if I'm playing rugby and I'm running with the ball and I'm kind of looking this way to decide whether to pass or to dummy, and I don't see a player here, and I'm running full speed and they do a nice clean tackle right across the hips. If my head jolts forward aggressively enough, it can actually still lead to kind of that bouncing effect. And so even though the head wasn't necessarily touched, can still result in someone developing a concussion. An example I like to give is that when the brain kind of bounces against the skull, some of the brain cells stretch a little bit, and that creates a very complex process we don't need to get into. But a good way of explaining that is kind of like an engine in a car if the cylinders are out of sync. So the engine will still run, the car might still get you where you need to go, but the other parts of the car might not work as well, and it's going to be a pretty clunky, unpleasant ride, and you're probably not going to feel so great when you get to where you need to be. So that disruption, that issue with calibration of how our brain controls different processes lead to the symptoms we feel, and that's what sends us to the doctor. So after we take a big hit, we feel headache, clumsiness, dizziness, difficulty concentrating, and that's probably going to put us in a doctor's office. They're going to go through our history and find out that I hit my head falling off of my mountain bike, and come to the conclusion of, all right, that hit has led to you now experiencing these symptoms of concussion. It's important to highlight the symptoms because right now that's the best way we have to measure, understand, and track this injury is just to ask people how they feel. And while that's useful, it's not necessarily always the most accurate. So a lot of the work we're going to talk about today is about how we're using technology to try and measure this injury more accurately and characterize it better to understand it in more detail. So I've just put together 2 little slides to try and get through 2 key concepts we're going to go through tonight. So in some instances, there's one big hit to the head, and that takes us from a nice, happy, healthy brain to a not-so-happy, concussed brain. Okay, and sometimes it's as straightforward as I went over the handlebars of my mountain bike, I hit my head, and now I feel like rubbish. But part of the work we're doing is that there's this idea of subconcussive impacts. So impacts that we might take during sport or different activities that by themselves don't trigger a concussion, they don't tip the scale to being concussed, but potentially through accumulating a lot of smaller impacts might lead to a tipping of the scale, like I've tried to visualize here, where we have a couple things come in and they don't do anything, we've still got a nice, happy, healthy brain, and that eventually it starts to tilt and then one thing might push us over. In terms of here, I've done 5 hits for the sake of illustration. We have no idea how many that is. We're still in very early days of understanding that, and that's what we're here to present about today. So with that introduction in place and understanding the difference between subconcussion and concussion, I'm going to introduce Prof. Nick Draper, who's going to talk about his work that's funded by the Neurological Foundation. And yeah, we'll go from there. Cool.
Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, pai ki te ea koutou. Te rangi te whanau te iwi te whare tēnā koutou. Ko Nick Draper tōku ana. It's great to be able to join you today. Thank you very much to the Neurological Foundation for the funding for our research, really importantly, but also to Matai Health and to Neurological Foundation for organising today. It's a great opportunity to come and talk with people. We're early in our research, so we were funded in 2021, and the title of our research is around, for short, collisions in junior rugby, and measuring those and looking at those. We're really interested in peak linear and peak rotational accelerations, and then the potential of headgear to maybe mitigate some of those accelerations. And present is kind of a project update in terms of where we've got to with the research so far, but also some of the other work we're doing. And it's all based around a sort of common theme. So before we go any further, though, hot off the press, I know the All Black squad has just been announced, but I thought it was nice to announce that the World Animal Rugby 15 has just been named. And so I thought you might like to know. That's always good to get some early news. I shared this with my sons, and my favourite character was like the silverback at 6. So just a little aside, and it highlights that I have a passion for rugby as a researcher. So we have a fantastic research team that is supporting all of our work. So both in terms of the study that we've got ongoing, we're going to talk about, but also all the parts of the research that are going on. Alexander, who invented the spring-free trampoline, is a really fantastic advisor and guiding light in terms of our research around the sort of engineering aspects of our work as well. The sort of team are divided up in terms of our project. At the moment, the collision study, they're divided up into an MRI neurocognitive team. We've got a field data team, so they're at every game, filming matches and also recording collisions, who work in the engineering lab at the university, and Daniel Stitt is one of the PhD students, and he never sees in a little office, no windows, crunching data all the time. But without those people, the research wouldn't be moving forwards. And the starting point of our research is that rugby has risks to it. We recognise those. Collisions involved in the head are not beneficial, obviously, but our focus is on, can we make rugby safer, and can we make it safer for children, especially playing the game? And our goal is to assess collisions and then to look at the potential of headgear to mitigate collisions with the head. And looking at the objectives. So first one is around measuring the incidence, so the number of collisions that players are...
Sorry, your microphone just keeps cutting out.
I'm going to stand, I don't like that one. I'll stand over here. So the first one is around measuring the incidence of collisions. Then we're looking at the second objective is around the size of collisions, so how bigger collisions players are involved in. Then we're looking at headgear and its potential to reduce. And then the last one is our sort of medical screening, which makes the study quite unique in the fact that we've got MRI scans completed with players pre and post season, and then post a diagnosed concussion, as well as some neurocognitive testing as well. In terms of the study, we were HDEC, which is the National Ethics Committee. We were exempt from that because of the nature of the research. So we've gone through all the other processes of approval that we needed to do. So that includes New Zealand Rugby and their medical scientific advisory panel, through to Canterbury Rugby, Crusaders, Ellesmere Rugby Union, and the clubs themselves. We also got, in the end, we've got a permission to work with 2 players who are playing for a high school team this year. And all of those have approved the research, and the university have approved it ethically as well. And we've started now. So our project is with a male team and a female team this season, and we're working with an under-16 male team and an under-17 female team. And the idea was to recruit 20 players for each team, and we've been able to just slightly over-recruit for the male team and just under, and that relates to the number of players in the squad as opposed to some players not wanting to be involved in the study. And we've actually had an amazing response from both parents and players who've been really excited to be involved in the research, and we've got almost 100% recruitment from each of the teams that we've been involved with. We're right in the middle of the data collection. We're just halfway through the season, and so that the pre-season testing has gone ahead. We had a mouth guard fitting, so we went to an orthodontist. All the players went to an orthodontist, had a scan of their mouths, in order to then get a custom fitted mouth guard. That data was scanned over to a company in Australia that make the mouth guards, and they then came back next day in the post. Amazing service, and they're instrumented mouth guards, and we'll look at those a little bit later on. But that's happened, and we're right in the middle of our data collection, which involves videoing games and recording collisions using the mouth guards. And then in August 2022, at the end of the season, we'll do our post-season catch up. And then we've got another whole season. So we are really quite early in the research. We've got another whole season of research before we finish the study. Around 40 players in the first season, and at least 40 in the second season, potentially more if we can secure a little bit more research funding. So we're on the way. This is how we're measuring our collisions. So what you have here is a mouth guard on the right-hand side, and within that there are accelerometers and gyroscopes, and they will record the collisions, and we get a trace that looks like that graph. And we've done some validation work on those mouth guards previously, and we've had a look at those in depth in terms of the data they collect for you, and they look to be really accurate and really helpful in terms of understanding collisions in more detail. The graphic at the bottom relates to data that's collected across a whole team, and each of those little black lines that's there represents a collision. So you can collect data and have an individual collision expressed in a graph, but you can also collect data and have a look across a whole game and look across a whole team in terms of collisions and where they occur. And that's what the trace looks like in more detail. There's a lot of noise with it because we've got data coming from different accelerometers across, and it measures it across in different angles, but it gives us a really good indicator of the peak acceleration and then what happens afterwards in terms of that collision. The mouthguard data is something, this is something that is quite exciting about that data, and the collaboration with Matai has been really important in terms of sort of thinking about where we can go with this. So we have data about collisions, and we'll have data from the MRIs in terms of players that are concussed around potential damage to the brain associated with a collision. But what we can do with our mouthguard data and some finite element modeling is to then model how that occurs. So we can test the model, and we can have a look and see if the model does a good prediction of what's happening in terms of that collision. And that will allow us to then in more detail test Headgear in the future in terms of its potential to mitigate collisions. So that's something that's in development, but is a really exciting potential use of the data when we finish the project. So our third objective is around the potential of Headgear to reduce collisions. And the headgear we've chosen to use is one by a company called N-Pro. And we'll talk through that just for a couple of minutes. So in our engineering lab, we have a drop test rig, which was built by some of our grad students. It's one of the cleanest in terms of its droppability and not losing data. So it's really well designed, and it has an instrumented head form that we can drop. And in the study that we did looking at headgear, we dropped from 3 different heights. And what we were interested in is to have a look at, because there was a recent change, 2019 change in the regulations regarding headgear. And so previously, headgear that was available commercially that you could buy off the shelf was designed around reducing cuts or colliers. And I'm sure many people have seen those or know people who've worn them, that sort of thing. But in more recent years, that was under headgears controlled by World Rugby under Law 12. And it has really strict criteria as to how the headgear has to be designed and how it has to work. But in recent years, companies have started to develop headgear that has been designed to try and reduce peak linear accelerations. And 2 companies that do that is N-Pro and Gamebreaker, which is a US company. N-Pro is an Irish company, and Gamebreaker is an American company. And the Gamebreaker units are these 2, the blue and the black units, and the N-Pro is this black with the green trim like the Ireland rugby team. And so this Law 4 is a new trial, and it's looking to see whether headgear could mitigate collision impact forces, and it allows a headgear under slightly different specifications to be worn as a medical device. So quite different in terms of approach, and it's the first time that's happened. And it's the only, I should just say, the only headgear that's been approved by World Rugby under that trial is the N-Pro headgear. So that's why we went with that headgear in terms of our study. This is some lab testing we did. So what we're doing in our study is to compare field to lab. And sort of does this, how the headgear performed in the lab, does it equate and carry on the same way in terms of a field trial? So what you've got is collisions, or you've got peak accelerations in collisions in our drop test rig. And we can look at the different heights that we drop from, and so these are the 3 heights we talked about. So the head form's raised to that height and then drop from there. And then when there's no headgear on, these are the collision or peak linear accelerations. And then we've got the traditional CCC, kukri, second skull type of headgear. And then we've got the newer units. And what the research showed was that both Gamebreaker and N-Pro did reduce peak linear accelerations relative to no headgear and relative to existing headgear. So that's why we've used, because of this approved trial, that's why we've used the headgear in the study. And with our drop test rig, we can get a very similar trace. That's in the laboratory, and then this is our field data. So Danion's work will be to look and recreate field collisions in the laboratory with the drop test rig. So we'll look at that and just highlight what's happening. So players opt into or opt out of wearing headgear. There's no compulsion, there's no sort of trial group with headgear and trial group without, because ethically that wouldn't be appropriate. Players choose to wear headgear or not. And we've had some players that have chosen to, and quite a lot of players that have chosen not to wear headgear this season. We haven't asked them to do either. And some have started with headgear and then haven't worn headgear. But because of the way we've set the study up, so we've got field data we collect, we can back translate in the lab, either with headgear on or without headgear on. So it doesn't matter whether they're wearing headgear, we can recreate. So if you've got somebody who hasn't worn headgear, they have a collision, we can recreate that in the lab without headgear on. Then we can put the headgear on the head form, and that will give us the degree of mitigation. Conversely, if we have somebody wearing headgear, we recreate the drop, the collision with headgear on, and then we take that off, and that gives us then the degree of mitigation in that way. So that's how the study is designed, but the wearing of headgear is totally optional for players. So what we do, so that's kind of where we're at with our research so far. So we're right in the middle of the season, and we'll be really excited, hopefully come back in the future and talk through the research as we sort of explore the data and sort of findings emerge. But we're also, we're a research team that have got a number of areas we're looking at. So one of the areas we're looking at is different types of headgear material, and can we improve on designs and so on. But another project we're looking at is around the ball carrier. So there's a lot of coach education now, and World Rugby and individual national rugby unions have spent a lot of time looking in terms of developing coach education. So all coaches that are involved in coaching junior teams in New Zealand undergo Rugby Smart or Small Blacks coach education. And a big part of that is around, in terms of the work you do, is around tackling and coaching the tackler. But there was a recent study that came out of Ireland that was indicating, and other studies have replicated this as well, of those, over half are to the ball carrier and not to the tackler. So that we focused in, I mean, as a coach myself, been through those coaching courses, and you talk about all the things, cheek to cheek, ring of steel, all of those kinds of things that are there. But if I ask people in the room, what are the coaching tips you give to the ball carrier? We haven't got those in the same way. So another part of our research is borrowing from one of the other sports that I've been involved in and coached, which is judo. So we'll just look, what I want you to look at is the control of the head of the judo players in these sequences. So some big throws, but their heads aren't slamming onto the mat. There's control of the head. So judo's been looked at as a sport that's been associated with rugby in the past, and it's mostly been around judo techniques and clearing out of the breakdown, or potentially some stuff around tackle. And judo coaches have been involved in rugby, but I think they were involved for the wrong reasons in some ways. Because I think the thing that judo potentially has is an ability to help the ball carrier, because of that learning to fall, and we'll talk about that in a second. But here's an example in a laboratory setting. So this is a proof of concepts and work that we've got ongoing with colleagues at Otago University, and we've designed a test rig that takes the floor out from underneath of a participant. They have this like a polished floor, their little sock booties they wear, and then you see this collision and you see this kind of whiplash type of landing. And what we have in terms of that proof of concept is that the landing and how somebody lands as a judo player will be different than how somebody lands as a non-judo player. And if we can put some of that training into rugby players, we can potentially help the ball carrier. And given that 57% of injuries in the tackle are around the ball carrier, it's probably something useful to look at. So that's where we're looking now. So previously looked at the breakdown, see if we can see a difference between judo players and non-judo players. If we can, then how do we train non-judo players, how do we train rugby players to fall differently? What does that intervention look like? Now that work is already underway. So we're looking at that already. And then, can we create an education package for coaches? Can we put something into the Rugby Smart training, which is around how you fall to improve falling? So that's another project that we're working on, and really happy to take questions at the end, and I'll hand over to Sam now. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So as you're sitting there watching me, you may be thinking that you're pretty still. That's actually not the case. Your head is wobbling around on your neck. So every time your heart beats, the blood comes up into your head and it wobbles your head around. And it's really difficult to see this motion with the naked eye. But you can amplify this motion using a special type of algorithm. And it looks rather funny, but here this group at MIT, this is a group in the US, has used a special algorithm to amplify the motion, in this case by 10 times. Now this wobbling motion is related to the blood flow that goes into the head as well as the brain pressure. And what we're doing at Matai, what we've been doing at Matai is developing this technology together with our collaborators, together with GE Healthcare. And what we're doing is using this type of amplification algorithm to amplify the motion of a certain type of MRI scan. So here we've taken a regular, what's called cardiac gated MRI, which kind of gives these MRI images in the form of movies. And we've amplified this motion by 50 times. So you can see this really subtle motion that's very difficult to see. This motion is about 0.1 millimeters. We've amplified it to a point where you can see the motion. You can see the brainstem motion here. You can't see my cursor. Yeah, the brainstem motion, the cerebellum motion, in some cases the frontal lobe and the cortex. So that you can really easily visualize it. And the underlying basic thought we had is that different diseases, different disorders, maybe injuries, it could make the brain move in a different way. And if we can understand this, what was going on with if we can see this motion, it can help us understand what's going on with different diseases, disorders. So in the case of mild traumatic brain injury, we thought that maybe we can see something in these amplified brain images. After all, we know in the case of more severe traumatic brain injury that it comes with an increased brain pressure. And what tends to happen is if you get a very severe traumatic brain injury, it damages the cells swell, and it results in an increased brain pressure. And there is some evidence across several smaller studies that we can see that type of swelling can occur in the more mild form of traumatic brain injury, i.e. in concussion. And what's also interesting about that is that different studies have suggested that that elevation of brain pressure that you get that can happen for a few days after you've had a concussion, and eventually it can return to baseline. And that return to baseline can correlate with the symptomatic and functional recovery of these patients. So we thought, okay, so can this amplified MRI method potentially detect these differences? Can it thereby be a diagnostic, like a biomarker of mild traumatic brain injury? So the specific question we have was, does the brain move differently after a concussion? And with our hypothesis is that a mild traumatic brain injury, again, may increase the cell swelling, which thereby increases the brain pressure. And knowing that the brain is in a closed system, we've got a skull, we've got a brain in it, which is largely incompressible. Therefore, if you've got the blood pumping up, a lot of the energy has been taken away as it's trying to force the blood into the head, and so the brain is likely to actually lose less energy, therefore, to make the brain move. And so this is very, very early days. We've only got some very preliminary data, so we need more data to prove this. But this is an example of someone who had a scan, and then they just happened to have a concussion, and we scanned them again. And what you can see is these are called maximum difference maps. So this gives you, the colours in these images give you sort of some idea about how much the brain moves. So if you see lots of colour, all this kind of colour in the central region of the brain, that would be more motion. If you see sort of less blue, less of these bright reds and greens, it would be less motion. And so what you actually see with this pre and post concussion is that in this case, the brain has moved less in that kind of lateral ventricle region and the brainstem midbrain region. And again, this is very, very early days, but that kind of fits with that hypothesis that cell swelling, increased brain pressure, less motion. So this is just an example of just one of the methods that we're using in a really, really advanced MRI toolbox that we've been acquiring longitudinally on people who have concussion, as well as on our rugby cohort. So what we've developed is this really comprehensive MRI toolbox, which explores a range of different things of the brain. So in MRI, we can look at structure, we can look at function, we can probe the brain networks, the changes in blood flow, which is associated with cognitive changes in the brain with concussion. We can also look at changes in the blood flow. We can look at something called diffusion MRI, which Josh is going to talk about, which gives it a sort of a marker of the axonal integrity. It can help pick up damage in the axons of the brain. And we've also got a method called MR spectroscopy, which looks at the brain metabolites or the brain chemicals, things like lactate. And there are certain chemicals that we can actually measure quantitatively in MRI. So the basic thought we have is it's not, potentially won't be one single modality that might tell us the picture of concussion or subconcussive injury, but it'll be a range of these different ways of looking at the brain that we can all throw together in one big model to be able to, so that we can come up with this marker of injury. And the other thing we could do, and Nick talked about this as well, is if we've got this imaging data, there's a wealth of information in this imaging data. We've got structure, we've got information about the sort of inferring the stiffness of the brain from this data. If you couple that data with the sensor data coming from the mouth guards, here we're using the same mouth guards as that as Nick's using. If we take that sensor data and we use it we can use that together with the imaging data to model what an impact looks like to the brain. And this is an example of, and Josh is going to talk a little bit more about this, where we've worked alongside the Gisborne Boys High teams, where they've had the same mouth guards embedded, and they're using the same mouth guards, and they have the 3 sensors which track the impacts over time. And so we're using this type of, using that imaging data together with this modelling approach. Now, this modelling approach has been developed by our collaborators at the Auckland Bioengineering Institute, Vicky Shim. And this is actually an example on data that she trained it on using American football data. So we're still in the process of working through these models with our Gisborne Boys cohort here. But this just gives you an example of what the types of things we can do with this data. One little note here is that there are a lot of other models around the world using this type of finite element modelling method, which take up to 2 days to process because it's very, very computationally expensive to run these models, but Vicky's model does it in 2 minutes. So it opens up the opportunity to actually embed these algorithms into the sensors so you can monitor the brain impacts in near real time with the hope that we can make the game a little bit safer. So I'm just going to pass on to Josh, who's going to talk a little bit more about the search for effective biomarkers on the field and how accumulating impacts might affect the brain.
Thank you. All right, so we're almost near the end. I just wanted to talk now about, we're a little bit further along in our very tip of the iceberg analysis of the subconcussive data that we've collected. So the important thing with this is the data we're presenting here is from about 30 rugby players who played a whole season wearing these mouth guards at training and games and didn't have a concussion over that span of time. They were just playing rugby like we normally do, okay? And so what we did here is we used the mouth guards, and just like Nick showed us at the beginning, we've got these little waves here. And our question initially was, how does the amount of load that a player sustained over the course of a season relate to changes in one particular MRI technique? I'm just going to wait this one out. Cool. Relates to one technique. So what we did here is I've just put these little arrows and circles on each of these waves. And basically this is the peak that we're talking about. And all we've done is for each player, we've just added all of these up for the course of the season. So if this player only had 2 hits, their total would be about 50 Gs. And if someone had 10 like this, it would be about 250 for the season, okay? We are interested in this technique called DTI, which looks at the cells in the brain that are called white matter. And what white matter do is they're kind of like the roads and the highways in our brain that takes information from one corner and carries it somewhere else. So it's not necessarily thinking cells in the brain, but they're really key to getting information to where it needs to go so those thinking cells can do their job. So this graph over here, you don't really need to see the details, you just see the different colored lines. This just shows the variability in different players and the amount of load they accumulate over the season. And the different colors we've tried to do here, it's a bit small, are grouped by position groups. So we've got centers, inside backs, outside backs, tight five, and loose forwards. And what we can kind of see is that it doesn't just group together neatly by position. That player by player, they're going to have different play styles, play different amount of minutes. They might be injured for a few seasons, or for a few games, so we need to take that into account when we look at our data. And so one of our team members is finishing up her PhD, her name's Mri, and she looked at 19 white matter tracts, which these two images give us examples in the same direction and connects different areas together. And so she looked at 19 of these different tracts and looked at how the change from the early season, preseason scan, how the difference between that time point and the end of the season relates to the amount of load over the course of the season. And what we saw is that only 3 of 19 of those tracks had a change that did relate to, sorry, lost my train of thought. 3 of those tracks, the changes we saw in them related to the amount of impact that players sustained, but that relationship is quite weak. Okay, so there is something there. They do kind of relate to one another, but when we look at these numbers at the bottom, what this one tells us is that in all of the change we saw in the white matter, only 10% of that change can be explained by the amount of hits players took over the course of the season. So it tells us something, but it really makes us ask more questions of what's the other 90% there? How much is just aging over time? How much was just maturation over the course of a season? On the previous slide, we looked at these waves here, and right now in our analysis, we're just looking at that peak there. But we can see these 2 waves are quite different, even though their peak is the same, or almost the same. So maybe it's not just the peak, maybe it's the shape of the wave that actually is important, and that might be due to different parts of gameplay that maybe allows an opportunity for a coaching and education intervention, or for some protective equipment or something to get in there and take care of those. Other things could be maybe that's just all that this technique that we're using tells us about this relationship. And as Sam said, it's more likely going to be that we're going to have to combine multiple things together to really start to understand this and start to answer these questions we have. And it's early days, like I said, tip of the iceberg here. But that's kind of where we're at right now. But we're hoping through combining these different strategies and working together, we're going to take an injury that is currently invisible and hopefully make it visible. And the difference that can make to how someone receives treatment, or what treatment they get, or when they might be cleared to return to play, and so on, are all the trickle-down effects of where we hope that this work is heading. So I think that was it. One last time, thank you to the Neurological Foundation, and thank you to Nick and the University of Canterbury for coming up here. And I think, Sam, and on behalf of Matai, thank you to all of our funders who make what we do possible. And yeah, I think that's it. Cool. Are we just sitting up here now?
Thanks so much to all our 3 speakers. I'll invite you up to our question and answer table. I know that it's been difficult to fit what all 3 of you do into something you can explain in 45 minutes, but that's fantastic. And I love this slide. It really shows how many people are involved in the research. And I know as the foundation, we couldn't do anything without the people that do the research, the people that participate in the research, and the people that financially support us. So that's really fantastic. And Margie is going to come round with a microphone. So we'll start the question and answer time. Just raise your hand, and our lovely donor relations specialist, Margie, will come round with the mic. If you put it into the mic, then the people who are joining us online will also hear your question. Thank you.
Gavin McLean. I'm just fascinated by I'd like somebody to explain why the best treatment is not rest, rest, rest.
I actually have a slide for that prepared just for that reason. Oh yeah, so we already switched to this. Yeah, so we used to think that just sit in a dark room, do nothing, that's the best way to recover. And then we started to realize that when that's the treatment they were getting, they weren't getting better. So like other injuries, if you roll your ankle, yes, there's a period of rest where things need to settle down a bit, but then it's about reintroducing progressive loading and building that ankle back up to do the job it needs to do. And so that's the same idea with when we hurt our brain, is we need to give it a little bit of rest, which is we now know is about 2 or 3 days instead of weeks or months, and then we start to build stuff back in. And so one tool that I've used when I've worked and done research in clinics is we use this idea of kind of this Goldilocks zone, where doing too little isn't going to help, doing too much isn't going to help, which particularly with young athletes is usually the problem, is they start to feel better and then they go full on training and back to everything, and then they kind of yo-yo up and down. So the idea is to find the sweet spot in the middle, and one tool we give people is, we call it a +3 rule, which is basically think about where your symptoms are on a scale of 0 to 10. 0 is I feel normal, 10 is I don't feel very good, I feel really, really bad right now. And say, okay, right now I'm a 2 out of 10. I'm going to try studying for my math exam. I'm going to try adding some exercise back into my routine. And if that goes up to a 3 or a 4, that's probably the stimulus we're looking for. That's going to kind of help the brain recalibrate and heal. And if we're jumping past that +3, we're not helping ourselves out. So it's that idea of if you're doing kind of rehab for other injuries, you do need to push it to kind of discomfort but not pain. And then you kind of incrementally add that process over time. Hopefully that answers that question. Cool. Sorry, I didn't realize we had already come to that slide.
So I've got a 14-year-old son. He had 2 concussions when he was 30. He's now 14. He's just in the late stage of recovery from a concussion this season, so we're pretty concerned about his future in terms of rugby. What would your advice be around that level of concussion at that age, and how worried should we be if he continues to play and gets concussed?
You want to go first? If you want me to. At the moment, to give you a clear answer is very difficult because there's so much we really don't know at this point in time. I think where I focus on it is I come at it from the rehab point of view. Is, you know, if you had a torn ACL and your ACL wasn't all the way back, you're not going to try and get back into that sport until you're all the way there. So I think that's the key thing is figuring out what resources he might need to get all the way back. And then we think if we actually give someone a chance to fully recover, that their likelihood for getting re-injured is just the same as anyone else. But it's, again, kind of using like a more easy to understand example. If your ankle's rolled and it hasn't healed, it's going to be easier to roll it and roll it and roll it again. So that's what I would say. And I know there's some people here who I can see tonight who are very skilled at helping out with that rehab process. So if he's still having a hard time, I would say plug into them, and hopefully they can get him on track. Yeah. Is that okay?
My name's Richard. I'll just wrap up 3 questions in one. First question is, what parts of the brain are you recovering through this rest period? Because I understand there's multiple brain parts. 2, second question is there any linkage between concussion and scholastic performance? And I'm sorry I've forgotten the 3rd question for now.
Is that me again? Yeah. All right. What was the first one again? Sorry. Different brain regions. So this type of injury, because there's the shaking, it's not necessarily specific to one area, which is kind of what makes it difficult and hard to pick up. So in other types of more severe brain injury or something like a stroke, if you look at an image, it's going to be pretty local to one area, which makes it not easier to pick up, but a bit more straightforward. Whereas with this, it's different hit to hit, person to person. and it depends on, as the finite modeling that Sam showed, depending on where it comes from, determines where the forces are going to go, and then the tissue properties in that. So it's highly variable is the answer to that question. And then the second thing, in relation to scholastic performance, I haven't read too many studies on that. In the short term, when you're having difficulty remembering and focusing and stuff, there's probably going to be an effect. But I'm not aware of anything that says long term, if you've had a concussion, that your grades are going to fall by 10% or anything like that. So yeah, I haven't read that much of that literature, but to my knowledge, there's nothing gross like that out there. Yeah.
Thank you, Bronwyn Holdsworth. So you talked about the tackling and the kind of impact you get from punching in the chest, for example. Are there different neurological signs in a brain image which shows whether you've been punched in the chest and have got a concussion via that, or some kind of injury, or hit on the head? Do different parts light up?
Sam?
So, yeah, so based on imaging, for a start, there's actually no objective biomarker that we know of. There's some promising markers in some imaging modalities, and there's particularly the one that Josh showed, the diffusion tensor imaging, that shows group-wise that there are differences, particularly in certain parts of the brain. Corpus callosum is that's the part that connects the two hemispheres together. That's supposed to be particularly vulnerable to concussion, but the actual mechanism, where it comes from, whether it's sort of hit this way or hit that way, it's very difficult to backtrack. It's hard to. I don't think you can tell. Whether it's where it came from. I mean, if you have a significant sort of hit from one, when we can see in several papers, if you have significant hits of one spot, you can actually see a localized damage in the brain, and you can see what's called the contracoup. You can see the damage as a result of the brain sort of hitting the other side of the skull. But generally, and that's a more severe traumatic brain injury. But in the more mild form, it's thought to be more of a sort of diffuse injury. So it's not just that, as Josh said, it's not just the local spot, it's actually the whole brain is affected in some way. That whole shearing that's happening in the whole brain. And that corpus callosum which connects it, is quite a vulnerable structure, so it's kind of thought to shear and twist. So, yeah, do you have another?
I think that the modelling is potentially a key to that answer, so that it's almost too early. So the mouthguard data that we're collecting will help us to then model and to understand what's happening and what the effect is of different types of collisions and different types of, I guess, the size of collision and so on.
Yeah. So it's going to depend on the magnitude of it, the sort of whether it's angular, whether it's linear, the location. There's a whole lot of the geometry of the brain, the age of the brain, the neck muscles. I mean, there's a whole lot of variables in there that can, I think that modelling, as Nick said, will help us paint that picture.
I think there's an exciting thing in terms of New Zealand in regard to that research, because there's a group at Otago that have collected data recently, which is around mouthguards and collisions. So you've got that data, you've got the data that's been collected in Gisborne, you've got the data we're collecting in Christchurch. All of that will feed into the modelling and help us to understand collisions better. But not only are we collecting mouthguard and collision data and then put that into modelling, we're also collecting video data, which allows you to look at what was happening, on the field in reality. So we can compare the modelling to what we see in the video to look at that. And one of the things that has emerged from the Otago study, because they're just analysing the data and there's some emerging results coming from that, is that males and females, the collisions are different. And so that's something that coaches can use immediately in terms of changing, sort of the coaching technique with female players as opposed to male.
I would add one point. I think, as someone who's not originally from New Zealand, if you couldn't tell by my voice, something that's really special about New Zealand is the collaboration across the groups, and that everyone wants to work together and kind of share ideas and share, and that's not always the case in the research world, as people kind of want to live in their silo and protect their thing. But that atmosphere is why New Zealand's really the kind of ideal ecosystem where I think if anywhere is going to figure it out, it's going to be here because of the willingness for people to work together.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that as well. After being overseas, it is in a lot of cases quite siloed, but New Zealand's sort of we're kind of acting like one big city where doesn't matter whether you're in Gisborne, whether you're in Auckland, Canterbury, if we all work together, we can solve this very complex problem. And further down the line, we can pool our data to power it. I mean, the big problem with what we've got is small sample sizes. So if you get the more data you have, the powers your study so that you can actually do good science and develop the technology in a way that's scientifically sound.
So can you foresee a situation whereby with the data that you're acquiring, you can make predictions or give informed advice about, for example, the length of a rugby season or some other season, so that, I don't know, if for example, I don't know what the length of the off season is for a rugby season, but let's say it's 12 weeks, can you draw conclusions and say, well, if it was 14 weeks, you'd get 98% of the injuries would be remediated, or you could maybe reduce the length to 8 weeks or something. Do you know what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we actually have a funding application to try and answer that exact question at the moment. So that's with World Rugby. And if we get the funding, we'll be trying to answer exactly that question of, what does recovery look like? How might the length of a season affect that, and so on. So don't know now, but it's certainly something of great interest at the moment.
So I think that the research can help, hopefully, in that diagnosis process, and then if we can understand where that's occurring in the brain, that can help you with the recovery, and then we can start to understand, okay, well, return to play should look like this.
Two quick questions. If someone, I'm referring to your almost like a slide, or the cumulative effect of your scale, that slide. So if someone has one concussion, and if they heal completely, are they back to base? That's the first part of the question. Or does it accumulate? Okay. And then the other question is obviously the difference between community rugby, school rugby, club rugby, and then compared to professional rugby. And obviously we've just seen the change in the return to play just over the last 48 hours or so. So just in the context of that, does someone recover the back to base?
Right now, again, without the objective marker, it's hard to say with absolute certainty because we're going most of the time off of symptoms, right? And that makes it very difficult. Athletes are particularly difficult from that point of view because of stand down times and all these different moving parts. Sometimes they don't honestly disclose symptoms, and so because they're kind of trying to get back faster. So it can be difficult to know at the moment when is someone actually really recovered and when are they ticking the boxes to kind of meet the recovery, which is, I think you'll probably talk to it more, but the differences at the different levels of the game and the stand downs, that's part of why that's in place, is to try and make sure, okay, at the base of the pyramid, let's kind of be as cautious as we can, and then it kind of changes to based on the different levels. Yeah. Anything for that?
No, I think the sort of focus of our research group is around trying to make rugby safer. And I think that comes from, we've got a number of areas of research we're looking at in terms of our work, but we also have to recognise kind of what World Rugby, what New Zealand Rugby are doing in regard to changes to stand down periods and so on for players to allow them to recover. We need the evidence. You've got a 21, 23 day stand down for junior players now. The question is, well, is that the right amount of time? We need the research that we're doing is really important in terms of that answer to that question. But from where rugby was and where it is now, that's a significant step forward, I think, in terms of supporting and helping players. And the rule changes. So this season in Canterbury, you can jump for the kick-off, but there's no jumping from a high ball, and the player can't be contacted when they're going for a high ball now. Those kinds of changes are good. The tackle height's gone down to below the sternum. There are areas that are trialing, sort of low down as well. And I think all of those things are around rule changes that support the sort of research work, and everybody kind of working together in terms of making the game safer.
And an example to extend off of that is one of my mentors was part of the research project that got the scrum rules changed. And because they saw when there was the big engage in the collapse, that's when very few, but when they did happen, catastrophic neck injuries would occur. And so through research that led to rule changes, that change in the engage has almost all but eliminated those really serious injuries. Yeah, so it's about, there's lots of opportunities once we know more about, coaching things differently or maybe modifying rules, but then still leaving the game as what we know it to be as much as possible.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Josh from Poverty Bay Rugby. Just firstly, before my question, just want to thank you all for the incredible work that you guys are doing, a very important body of work, but also acknowledge how fortunate we are to have Matai Research Centre in Gisborne, so I just wanted to thank you all. Actually, before I asked my question, I'll answer Dame Bronwyn's around the off-season. Currently here, our junior club seasons are only 10 weeks. So it's an incredibly long off-season. However, active people are active. So what they do in the off-season is they're doing other things as well. But we are one of the shortest junior seasons in the country. Just trying to encourage our junior athletes in particular to try other things and align with Sport New Zealand's Balance is Better approach. My question is, what do you need to know more? What can we do, the community or otherwise, to help your research or possibly provide you with the information to know more? Because one of the answers from you, Josh, and good to see you again, is we don't know much. So how do we get to a place where we do know more?
Can I just, before we go over to Josh, I just want to say a huge thank you, Josh, for all of your support, and also it's just that the work with the Gisborne boys rugby team has been absolutely critical to what we're doing, and they've devoted 2.5 hours of their time 3 times for us to get probably the most comprehensive data set in the world with all the different markers, and so the patience they've had and the engagement that we've had going both ways, it's just, we really, really appreciate that, and we couldn't do our research without your support. And the goal really is, given the the benefits of sport, everyone knows that it's it's fabulous for your team camaraderie and the cardiovascular side. Our big goal is really to make the game safer. In terms of what you could do for us, if we continue with this engagement, we do need to get more data. We're still underpowered with our data sets, and we also need control data as well for it would be sports for athletes, non-contact athletes at similar ages. That's what we're looking for at the moment as well, alongside another season of data. So, Josh, you want to take an...
I think from the community point of view, we're getting exactly what we need. Since moving here about 18 months ago, it's been really cool to be a part of seeing this community really get behind this, from the likes of yourself to the school, to the parents, to the boys. So from that point of view, we're sorted, as long as we can keep that going. I think it's really about, at this point, it's about time and money to get the data we need, to have the resources to crunch it, and to get enough of it to actually be able to affect change. But from the community point of view, these types of studies, typically you would expect maybe 50 to 60% of people who start the study to finish the study, just because of the reality of research, and especially what we ask people to do is a lot. And with our study, we've had 86% retention. So it just goes to people getting behind it and feeling we've done our best to try and make sure that the community feel like partners in this, and that it's not just kind of us doing our own thing and kind of drag people behind us. It's all kind of together. So from that point of view, I think the community is doing everything, and it's just up to us to find the money and the time to do the rest of it. Yeah.
You've tweaked my curiosity with a couple of peak accelerations on a graph of 25G. Can you just outline the sort of range of accelerations you measure, and is there a ballpark figure for a sort of an obvious concussion or knockout?
Well, the range, so we apply a filter at least to the mouthguard data that starts, I think, at 8 or 10 Gs, because anything less than that is just walking around being a human. So for the most part, we're not going to see anything in our data less than that, because we intentionally leave it out, because there would be thousands and thousands of those just from people moving around and walking. In terms of the range, I think looking at our data, it's ranging from that kind of 10 to probably 70, 80, something like that in there. And the distribution is very skewed. So there's a whole lot of them at the very small end of the spectrum and very few at the higher end of the spectrum. I forget what the second half of it was. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I think the Gs is an interesting use. I've got a slide in another presentation that kind of quantifies those according to different levels in terms of what they are. So a G is an acceleration to gravity, and obviously then multiples of. But you can get quite significant Gs recorded on a mouthguard from wild stepping movements and running movements. So it isn't necessary, you can have quite a high reading, and it's to do with movement and change of direction, change of speed, so change of acceleration. So you can have some numbers in there in the 20s and so on, and it doesn't necessarily relate to quite significant effect on the brain. So the more data we have, the more we can understand the effects of those. And then of course there are accelerations associated with indirect and direct collisions, and differentiating those in terms of the modelling will be really helpful for us in the future.
In terms of like a threshold, that's, if there was this magic threshold where beyond 35 Gs there's an injury, that would make this a lot easier. But that's the challenge, is that everyone's different, their injury history is different, potentially the amount of hits they've taken recently could affect it, potentially their diet could affect it. Like there's all these things that we don't know in terms of that threshold, which is why I intentionally with those slides at the beginning did a seesaw and not a threshold, because it's complicated, and I think the seesaw kind of tries to communicate that a bit better.
I hear of people who were playing, say, rugby 50 to 60 years ago and developed what I term, but it may not be a correct term, a brain injury affect, maybe dementia, in later life, which I think some study says that these can relate back to the rugby playing days. Now, why doesn't the brain immediately click and the person goes into a dementia state earlier than later in life? And what you're doing now presumably will help people who get dementia or the like in later life.
I think, I'll talk from our sort of research group's perspective, and our focus is on junior players now and how we can help them moving forwards. Rugby rules, understanding of concussion and collision, so on, was different in the past, and so and there are other research groups that are looking at the effects of and potentially around connections between concussions in previous history and the development of dementia, but it's not something as our research group that we've been looking at, but I think it's an important area to look at, definitely.
And I would just add to that is the game has changed for the better. So that's one thing is looking forward. You know, it's not as simple as saying playing rugby led to those people getting dementia. There's so many other factors at play involved with that. But looking forward is the game is becoming as hopefully as safe as it can become for the future generations. And in the meantime, we're still really having trouble understanding an injury that happened yesterday, let alone injuries that happened 40 or 50 years ago. So it's a great question, but at this stage, it's just not something that we can really provide the answers for or have the evidence to provide answers for.
So there's just one more question and a couple from the live stream as well, if that's okay.
Is there, you know how rugby players get tackled and onto the ground? Is there a way to land on the ground to not get injured?
Question for you, Nick.
I think I'll have to answer. So the research that we're sort of undertaking is looking at potentially yes to that. So it's around, there's some studies that have gone on that have looked at strengthening the neck muscles, and so that might be protective for players. However, if you do that alone without any sort of skill development, then it doesn't mean you're going to engage those when you fall. So judo players go through a process of learning to fall, and they fall backwards, forwards, and to the side. Now, when you're tackled, you know, sometimes you tackle and you fall forward, sometimes you go to the side, and sometimes you tip straight backwards. If you can control your head in that movement, then that's helpful and protective. It doesn't mean you're not going to get a concussion, but it might prevent one if you control or lessen an impact because you can control the head. So that's something we're working on now. And again, going to sort of Josh's point, it's around time to collect that data and to understand it. And hopefully in the future, it's around coach education intervention. So if you play rugby, I'm sure you've done all those things around cheek to cheek with a tackle and the ring of steel and all those kinds of tips. What we want to have in the future is some key pointers to think about how you fall. And every rugby club might have a little soft mat in the cupboard where they have the tackle pads and that sort of thing. And then there's the process that players go through as they go through, even from Ripper Rugby through, around learning to fall. So one of the things that's a challenge for rugby, I think, is that you hear a lot of talk. I don't know what Josh will know the age that players start tackle, but in Canterbury it's at under 8s. And they talk about, rugby's been concerned about losing players that move away when you go from ripper to tackle. But the focus on that is always about people being nervous of tackling and the contact of tackling. But I wonder how much is nervousness about falling. And I think you actually have to approach both. And I think we haven't quite got that yet. And I think that there's the potential to. And so that hopefully will make it better, for the future.
And falling is a skill.
Yeah.
Like you can definitely learn how to fall.
Yeah.
I did a lot of like skiing and skateboarding growing up. And if you know kind of how to tuck and roll, you can take some pretty hard falls and walk away fine. And then you watch someone who it's their first time on the hill and they throw themselves off a jump and they just kind of flail and sprawl and they don't have as good of a day afterwards. So you can learn how to fall.
So just a couple of questions from the live stream. First one is best treatment for post-concussion syndrome.
Josh, we've got Gil here.
We have Gil.
So just so that everyone knows, we've got a wonderful new recruit, Dr. Gil Newburn, who's a neuropsychiatrist who's with Matai. Gil, I wonder if you might want to answer that question.
Sure.
Yep.
Come and stand up front.
Yeah, come up here. I'll get you a
Embarrass myself. And you might need to tell me to shut up now I've actually got hold of the mic. Thank you. And post-concussion syndrome is a generic syndrome for people who have chronic symptoms, and we've heard a lot about injury today, but the reality is somewhere between at least 30 and 50% of people who've had so-called mild injuries have enduring symptoms, and we don't know why some people have symptoms, why they don't. We've heard some of the factors around G-forces, that the G-forces in themselves mean nothing without data that relates to how we break down that barrier between our blood vessels and our brain, which we saw beating with the amplified work, and the brain itself, because various things transport across that. We don't know anything about who's going to have a good outcome or a bad outcome until we know who and what has a secondary injury, because we tend to think of brain injury as something that happens at the point of impact. You're tackled, you fall over, you bang your head on the hard, sort of early season ground, you have an injury, or the problem is that impact sets in train a whole set of 5 or 6 at least other different cascades which continue to injure the brain, and that becomes important with, for example, the dementia question. We know that inflammation can be set up in the brain, and there's evidence that lasts for at least up to 20 years or so, some of those changes. I was going to ask Samantha, what happens with the amplified work and how much that is tied up with fluid, because Sam mentioned cells swelling, but is that stiffness in the brain that we see and that extra movement arising because the energy systems break down in a cell because what are called mitochondria don't function as well, and that causes cells to swell up? Or is it because a protein in the brain called aquaporin 4, which is very important for the way fluid flows in and out of the brain, gets damaged, and that creates general brain swelling? Is it both? And we don't actually have good ways of measuring that at this stage. We certainly can't do that match side, and we can't do that in a range of other ways. And these are the kinds of questions that we need to ask. In terms of post-concussion syndrome and chronic symptoms, these arise because the connections in the brain break down. So whatever pathology you're looking at for brain injury, it's a loss of connections in the brain, and while you might have an impact in one point, it's the rotational forces and the changes throughout the brain that influence that. And we know that the brain works in certain networks which are tied up with certain functions. And by talking to people, people tend to think of talking to a person and taking a history as being somehow subjective. It's not the same as doing a test or a scan, but the reality is we communicate with people by talk and conversation, and it's just as objective as the MRI. It's just a different form of objectivity. We talk to people, we do the scans, we put those together, we get good results. But by talking to a person, you can isolate certain symptoms which we know are tied up with certain network dysfunctions. We can provide treatments that address those things specifically, and whether it's a problem in cognitive areas, so whether it's attentional or apathetic, or problems with metacognition, thinking about thinking or thinking about what other people are thinking, theory of mind, whether it's behavioural, so whether you've got an impulse control problem or you're apathetic, whether it's physical, so whether you get tired, whether you get headaches, whether you have vestibular problems, whether you have temperature control problems or what have you. We can identify a lot of these things, and there are specific treatments. Josh mentioned exercise and the importance of starting exercise at 3 or 4 days after the injury and doing it in a way that's controlled. And I tell people they've got to be doing half an hour a day, at least 8 days a week, but it's got to be at the level that you can, what you do today you can do tomorrow and the next day and the day after, and so on and so forth. Now, there are a lot of arguments about why that works, but there are 2 very good arguments. We know that the systems in the brain that control blood flow and a lot of other autonomic things, so how our whole blood flow, breathing, metabolism ties together. We know that exercise is good for resetting that in ways that it ought to go. We also know that the brain is breaking down and forming new connections very, very quickly and rapidly, and that's driven especially by a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and simple aerobic exercise boosts the levels of BDNF activity as well. So, I mean, exercise may be the single best thing you can do after brain injury. There are lots of other things. Knowing yourself, understanding your brain, not overloading yourself, avoiding boom bust, doing stuff at a pace that you can manage and repeat, because if you look at the end of a week, you'll do a lot more by doing that than by putting your head down, your bum up and going for it and getting knackered and then writing yourself off for the next 3 or 4 days. So these are important structures, and there's not one way of doing it, there are several, and there's no one professional who can do all of this either. I mean, the moment you hear someone tell you they've got all the answers, you stop believing anything they say because they simply don't get it. So you've got to have an appropriate team of people who have these different skills that they can tie together. And this is one of the wonderful things about Matai, and it's what's brought me back to Gisborne. I was here in Tikaraka as a GP before I did my specialist training donkeys years ago. But it's coming back to work with people from different disciplines and with expertise that I could only dream of having and will never have, to make connections. So that's a very, very long and wordy answer to what seemed to be a simple question.
We've got one last question, and this is from the live stream as well, so I may not pronounce the words right, but you said there was impact on corpus callosum and the inner structures rather than the cortex. Are deep nuclei or other deep structures maybe the amygdala? Also known to be affected more?
So do you want to answer that, Gil? Gil knows more.
Yes.
That's from one extreme to the other.
It again comes back to what I said before. It's about connectivity. So, for example, we have a network in our brain called the salience network that it's the pre-conscious network that tells us if something is relevant to us and what's the emotional direction of that, or do we need to back up and collect a bit more data and information before we let our brains react. Now, that is designed to tell us whether we can stay still, whether we've got to jump out of the way, whether it's a saber-toothed tiger that's going to have us for dinner or just a shadow behind the tree. That network is affected by stress. Living with a brain injury is a highly stressful process, quite apart from the impact of the injury itself. That means you lose connections. Remember I mentioned BDNF before. It's very, very strongly represented in that part of the brain, probably more so than any other part of the brain. And if you lose connections, you lose the capacity to back up. Your brain defaults to presuming things are negative until proven otherwise, so everything becomes the saber-toothed tiger that you have to react to. So you become angry, you develop an impulse control problem, you snap at people, you piss off your relatives, your friends, everyone else because you're getting grumpy and irritable. And that creates a whole lot of secondary issues. That's because the pathway from that network into the amygdala that says back up and collect more data is not working. So it's a loss of connection. So you see all these nuclei, other subcortical centres potentially affected by lack of connectivity, both out of the injury itself, out of the secondary pathological processes, and out of the stresses of living with brain injury.
Thanks so much, Gil, and I want to say a huge thank you to our 3 speakers as well. It's a really complex topic and there's a lot more research to go, but it's just fantastic to have it underway and to just look forward to the results that are going to come out soon. So I just want to close this evening by saying a huge thank you to everyone for coming and for those who are joining us on the live stream, and to Matai for joining with us tonight. Thanks.
Hold on.